Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for sticking with us. I know it's been a long day, but hopefully we should give you lots of food for thought during this next hour. So welcome to what promises to be a fascinating discussion on real-life cases and consequences of disinformation. As Chase said, my name is Rebecca Skippage. I am head of the BBC's Disinformation team, which is part of BBC Monitoring. For those of you not familiar with our work, Monitoring has 200 journalists. We track, translate, and analyze open source media around the world. And for 80 years, propaganda, disinformation has been very much one of our stock in trades. So we're well placed and very pleased to be part of this conversation. We're privileged this afternoon to be joined by a panel of experts who will be bringing specific examples of experiencing disinformation campaigns to us, and we'll also be discussing commonalities and differences. Of course, we also have wide experience within this room, so I would encourage you to participate fully in the Q&A section of this discussion, and I plan to give that plenty of time, so please do have your questions ready. Let me introduce the panel to you. Actually, let me get them all out, and then I'll introduce them while they're sitting here. Welcome to the stage. So to my left is Mark Power, Deputy Ambassador to Israel. He was head of strategic threats at the UK mission to the UN, including during the Salisbury Skripal case, which we'll talk about further a little later. Olga Robinson is a senior journalist at the BBC. She is part of the disinformation team. Her expertise is in Russia and the FSU, and Olga has given evidence and advice to NATO Stratcom and the UK government, amongst many other things. Priyank Mathur is an expert on digital literacy, countering violent extremism and online disinformation. He's extensive experience in digital literacy and disinformation, especially in South and Southeast Asia, and is the founder and CEO of Mythos Labs. And David Scraven is the founder and publisher of Correctiv, which is the first non-profit newsroom in the German-speaking region. Correctiv investigates injustice, abuses of power, and promotes media literacy, and you're also implementing educational programs. So join me in welcoming them. So all of those on the panel are, as you have heard, active practitioners in this field. And I want to start by exploring what it's like to be really in the thick of an incident that involved disinformation claims, counterclaims, denials. The case of this poisoning by Novichok of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury in England last year was extraordinary from a journalistic point of view. You were sort of thoroughly involved in the case at the UN. Well, talk us through your experience.
Well, I thought it might be worth explaining. Sort of the first question is why were we involved in the UK mission in the UN? And the reason really was that we decided really early. It was one of those, I was called into the office and I didn't really know why I was called into the office, but something strange had happened in Salisbury. And I thought it might be connected, and I got into the office and kind of had London on the line. And really what we wanted to do, what they wanted to do was to use our membership of the Security Council as the means of kind of putting out the government's message as to what had happened. So that kind of put made the UN, given that this was an international incident, that was the reasoning behind it, the sort of key place where we were sitting with Russia and kind of putting forward our case to the rest of the international community, and they were responding. And I know that Olga is going to kind of talk about a bit more about the sort of ways in which the Russians responded and how they responded with the counter-information. But from a sort of practitioner's point of view, as you said, we basically had the objective that we wanted to put out our case, and in the kind of framing of this discussion, it's about national security threats. And, for a country, it doesn't really get more serious than another country conducting a hostile act causing potentially, in this case, well, it did cause death of your citizens, not the ones they meant to kill, but innocent members of the public. It doesn't get more serious than that, really, short of war. We had we wanted to produce an effect on Russia, which was, as we saw in the end, that more than 150 Russian intelligence operatives were expelled from a number of countries around the world. But in order to do that, we had to convince our partners and colleagues that they were a threat and that our version of events was the right one. So we wanted to be transparent, and we wanted to bring them together, and we wanted to use the UN as the forum in which to do that. But of course, that very directly subjected us to the sort of counter propaganda machine that the Russians have, and as Olga and others on the stage will know, this is a very powerful, historically powerful beast. But I think that we saw in the course of that campaign a lot of innovative and new and different things being deployed. And I think if I were to take one thing out of today, which I know that you said when we were talking about this in the in-between periods, but others have said this afternoon, Russian sort of methodology has changed, and instead of wanting to win the argument or present their own version of truth as the most credible, they just want to actually attack yours and delegitimize your own version. And so we had a number of tactics that were deployed in the Security Council, which then were basically, we sort of couldn't really understand, because from our point of view, the Russians, as they were presenting their counter case in the Security Council, seemed to be hysterical and slightly over the top, and not really very credible. And it wasn't until we sort of looked at how some of the things that they were saying were being used in social media and online and in different ways that we understood that really the sort of 100 people sat in that room were not really the target audience of why they were behaving like that. And actually, they were doing certain things in order to kind of be able to replay it and relay it in different ways to different audiences using those channels. So just some examples of that. Well, actually, I mean, a first framing thing about process in government, because I think some people have mentioned, I think, in the course of today, that governments are not the best or the most agile in terms of putting information into the public domain. We're very good consumers of it when we suck lots of information together, particularly in the national security space. But in terms of an external threat, this is exactly the kind of incident that we hate talking about in public. To this day, there's be someone from the Ministry of Defence who would, sort of send a bullet my way if I actually use the name of the chemical agent that was used in Salisbury. We decided that we could call it, after much, much debate, a Novichok in public, because that did not release any potentially helpful information to any terrorist or non-state actor who might learn something from us legitimizing or putting in the public domain any information about that chemical agent. The real name of it we can't use, even though it's widely used in the public domain. And it's just debates like that, which we went over and over and over again for hours and hours and hours, that you don't see on the outside, because probably most people just thought, why can't the UK government just explain exactly what happened and why it thinks as it does? But if you're relying on intelligence information for your picture of how it happened, and you're relying on sensitive knowledge about chemicals that could be proliferated and used to kill people, the discussion's very difficult. So as a precursor to all of that, we were working extremely hard. I was basically making myself extremely unpopular with my colleagues in Portendown, in the chemical weapons establishment, and in the Ministry of Defence and others, by arguing that information which they never thought should go anywhere near the public should go into the public domain in order for us to convincingly argue our case as to what we believe had happened. And essentially, the Russian response exploited that because they knew that there would be certain things that we would be very uncomfortable talking about. So they sought to exploit those things. And they also knew that they could turn it into a spy novel and a theatre, which would play on, I think, the attractiveness of the story that they wanted to, an angle of the story that they wanted to kind of use to undermine our case. And like some examples of that were the Russian permanent representative in the Security Council referring to Midsomer murders, which is apparently a really popular detective. It's a fairly staid British detective series based in the English countryside, in this sort of implausible village where all these murders happen, and there's a sort of happy, sort of easygoing detective always on hand to investigate them. But it's apparently really popular in Russia. And so we kept having the Russian ambassador making all these jokes in reference to Midsomer murders and how sort of the British government needed to employ whichever detective, I can't even remember the name
Barnaby.
of the Barnaby, exactly. We needed to call up Barnaby and help us investigate this, because Barnaby would surely have done a much more professional investigation than the sort of Keystone cops who'd really investigated it. Again, the sort of stuff that we basically discovered later was just being used as kind of like material for viral tweets and attacks on our kind of case. There was the sort of bizarre questions relating to what happened to the cat. The cat had mysteriously disappeared. What happened? Did we kill the cat? Where's the cat? This missing piece of information must explain why the British have made up this terrible story only to frame the poor innocent Russians. And again, what is one of the most tweeted pieces of material? It's like cat pictures. The public love stories about animals, and again, we just could only assume that really what they were trying to do there was really play into that. And then you get down to the slightly more sinister ones where they would just misinterpret willfully international convention or international law. So I had a massive argument on Twitter with the Russian deputy permanent representative because they kept asking this question: why have you not provided access to the Skripals, the Russian embassy with consular access to the Skripals? There's a Vienna Consular Convention. You're required to give, it says that you are required to provide access to them, and you're in violation of that convention. There's a small omission in that statement. The Vienna Convention requires you to give access to people you've detained as prisoners. The Skripals were not detained. They were in hospital recovering from the Russian government trying to murder them. And it wasn't perhaps in that context particularly surprising that they had no desire to speak to the Russian government. But again, it's easy to portray that and hard, and if you're a government, to sort of, without acting on behalf of the Skripals, which we didn't want to do because they're private citizens and entitled to their own privacy, we didn't want to be defending them, but at the same time, we did want to be saying, we did need to kind of try and confront that. So I've probably talked for long enough about the specifics of it, and we can get into any questions if people are interested, but it really used all of that to kind of convey essentially the sense of asymmetry that we very quickly found ourselves in when we were confronted. Basically, I think we were both, as governments, surprised that we had to deal with this in public. I don't think, but I could be wrong, the Russian government had any intention that this would have become the big public incident that it did. And we were obviously surprised it was by the nature of the incident. But when we found ourselves in those situations, our default instincts, which were to be calm and collected and to kind of be careful about the information that we put in the public domain, were very much strained by their sort of default instincts to throw as much disinformation into the public domain as possible, amplify that, and exploit it in the public domain. But perhaps that's a good note on which to kind of pass over to Olga, who can explain the impact of it.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to sort of to say, Olga, that this notion of it used to be to convince, now it's to confuse, very much seems to be playing into how it's being sort of perceived from a domestic perspective. You're somebody who's observed domestic media for a long time. How did it play out? What was the life cycle, if you will, of this?
Well, the life cycle, Rebecca, still continues. And in fact, quite recently, I watched a 4-part documentary on one of the state channels that was still dedicated to the Skripal poisoning, and a lot of the things that we saw over the past year and a half now have been repeated there. And in the immediate aftermath of the attack, what we saw in the next few months was essentially a textbook campaign that involved a very loose network of state actors, of social media actors, bloggers, what looks like trolls and some bot activity as well, officials, all working essentially in what appeared to be in unison and pushing contradicting lines, narratives, trying to present an alternative explanation or multiple alternative explanations as to what actually happened in Salisbury, with the aim of essentially deflecting blame away from Moscow and confusing people and undermining the very concept of truth. So at the very end, I was talking to one of the Russian experts on this, and he said, well, essentially what you get at the end is that you sit in front of your TV set and you feel like there's no truth. No one knows any truth. We will never know any truth. So what's the point of even caring about it? Well, somebody did it. Anyone could have done it. And the fascinating point here is anyone could have done it. That we've seen multiple dozens of conspiracy theories and lines about the origins of Novichok, whether it was from Ukraine, whether it was from Porton Down, whether it was from the US, whether some scientists sold it to some security service somewhere, whether it was from Russia, whether it wasn't, whether Skripal was an important witness to something, or whether he was completely useless, whether it was all a conspiracy to undermine first the Russian elections, because it was the year of when President Putin was re-elected for the second term. And also then it was linked to the World Cup in summer. So all these lines were pushed in a very, very quick succession. And it seemed to have had a certain effect on domestic audiences in Russia, because in October, an independent pollster did a survey, and what they found was absolutely fascinating and slightly surprising even to seasoned Russia watchers. What they found was that 56% of respondents said that, well, perhaps it could have been anyone who tried to kill Skripal. Only 3% of them said that it was the Russian military intelligence that was behind the attack. Only 3%. It is quite remarkable. And 28% said perhaps the British. And the interesting thing about it is that sociologists are slightly in two minds about the results. Some of them say, well, yes, this is a sign that propaganda and these multiple narratives did manage to confuse people to the point that they think that anyone could have done it, and we will never learn the truth. But others suggested that perhaps the truth was so uncomfortable for some of the respondents, just even the notion of their state being involved in essentially a state-sponsored assassination attempt, that it was too difficult to acknowledge. So they knowingly repeated some of the Russian lines without actually believing them.
So really interestingly, we're talking about sort of consequences, and we're going to talk in a moment to Priyank about how disinformation can cause sort of huge fractures around societies. But what you seem to be saying is that this disinformation or this confusion actually caused sort of national cohesion of some description.
Well, in a way, yes. And it was very interesting because it was the attack itself happened just before the presidential election, which Putin won by a landslide. And then, well, anecdotal evidence, without naming any names, but when I went back to Russia to just meet some of my friends, my acquaintances, there, a few months after the attack took place, people who always told me that they were not interested in politics and never watched Russian television and never listened to anything, and are just like normal Russians. They told me, why is Britain being so weird? why are we being singled out? And that really was interesting to hear that from people that I know and people who I trust and people who say they're not really interested in politics. So there was so much information doing the rounds in the immediate aftermath everywhere, on social media, on television, in the newspapers, in online media. People were bombarded with loads of confusing narratives and lines, and it apparently affected some people who are not normally interested in that. And the life cycle itself, sort of going back slightly back to the first point, was also very interesting because we saw, in some occasions, a claim would be, for example, will start spreading somewhere on Twitter, and then it will be picked up by online media, then moved on, well, we'll see it spread to television, and then occasionally even, in some cases, even officials speaking to TV presenters would repeat some of the claims that we previously saw in some obscure anonymous channels or on some, in some anonymous accounts on Twitter. And one such example, which was quite remarkable, was last September when the Metropolitan Police released the photographs of the two Skripal suspects, then identified as Ruslan Bashirov and his, I forgot his name, Petrov. They released CCTV footage, and the most widely picked up one was of them in Gatwick Airport when they're going through non-return gates. And the images do look very, very, very similar. And at first you might actually think that, oh, they look identical. And it's impossible for people to be at the same time with the exact timestamp. So what we saw on Twitter in particular was this very notion that, oh, the British are apparently faking evidence because there's a timestamp on the two pictures and it's exactly the same timestamp, exactly the same time, and they just couldn't have been there at the same time unless they've created a time machine. But the fascinating thing about that was that the pictures were different, actually. It was quite quickly debunked. There was a tiny red spot in one of the pictures and the angle was slightly different, so it was clear that it wasn't identical. But in a few hours after that claim was spotted by us on Twitter, we heard it being repeated on national television in one of the primetime talk shows by the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, who questioned the narrative and questioned the evidence and actually said that, well, they either know how to do time-lapse or they just couldn't have been there at the same time.
Mark, did you want to come in?
Well, it was interesting as well, and immediately the Russian ambassador was also asking the same question in the Security Council, and the fact that, you know, we just simply, I mean, I looked at it and just immediately just thought out of my own mind, of course, there are, you know, at Gatwick, there are several parallel gates, so they just went through the thing, but then if you think about it as government, are you going to go and get a shot? Like, in order to win that war, you basically want to be able to very quickly deploy a picture of three identical gates next to each other to be like, they just went through the three ones. But of course you don't have that. And of course it takes forever to actually get someone to do that and then have that. And I don't think we ever, I kept saying we should do it, I don't think we ever succeeded in just getting that kind of like immediate rebuttal out there. And it's just to kind of go back to my original point, that it's so much easier to kind of ask that question and then to kind of like make a huge deal out of it, and people still bring that up to me.
And I do occasionally see memes with cats and the Skripal cat investigates and
I think
things
ducks
like that.
were involved as well, if memory serves, in some capacity of the whole Skripal thing. Let's move on to another part of the world, but again something where this time social media is playing a sort of a huge part in what is very real societal breakdown, and actually, you know, the cost was human life. And this is disinformation or misinformation, kind of question mark on social media. Priyank?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the instances I thought it'd be worth talking about is, I don't know if anyone in the audience has heard of a town called Baduria, about 500 kilometers away from Calcutta. It gained notoriety a couple years ago when there was a massive riot there that lasted days, killed dozens of people, thousands of dollars of property destroyed. It was a Hindu-Muslim sectarian conflict, all sparked by a single meme that was posted on a Facebook page. So what happened is a 16-year-old kid named Sautik Biswas, Hindu kid, on his Facebook timeline, he posts an image of the prophet, but it's clearly a very disrespectful image, like designed to provoke. And sure enough, the Muslim community in the town is offended. It's a very small town, the kind where everybody knows everybody. So some members of the Muslim community show up at this guy's house, and they say, we want this boy held accountable. The police come, they take the boy away, they book him on obscenity or whatever, causing mischief, whatever. And it looks like calmer heads are going to prevail, looks like law and order will prevail. But what happened is, while the Muslim community and a few members of them were outside this boy's house, somebody took a video of that, of one of the Muslim men kind of just gently shoving, literally running into somebody. And we weren't even sure if the person he ran into was Hindu or not. It was just a video of two people colliding outside this boy's house, uploaded it onto YouTube with the caption, "Muslims are coming, and destroying this poor boy's family, send help." And before you knew it, you had truckloads, and we know they were from out of town because when the police did their investigation later, the people who were doing a lot of the rioting and the looting were speaking Hindi, which is a language not spoken within hundreds of miles of this city. So people from out of town coming by the busloads, and then they were retweeting images, and that was leading to more images being put up and texts, and before you know it, you can probably guess how this ended. Shops burnt down, people killed in very violent ways. And by the way, perhaps sadly, most sad of all, later on when the police finished their investigation, they found out that the original meme that was posted on the boy's Facebook page, his account had most likely been hacked, they determined. So even that wasn't really real. So it was just an example of a lot of misinformation. There are plenty of specific examples. And I think when people talk about fake news and misinformation, disinformation, it's easy to lump it all together, but it's important to remember there's different kinds. There's what you would call truthing, which is, you've probably seen those memes where it's like, exposed Trump sex tape with whatever. It's clearly wrong. Well, in that case, I don't know. But they always try to caption it with this, I've got the truth. This is the sensational story. There's social proofing, where you upload a video, get bots to retweet it and watch it and drive up the view count to 10,000 views, and then people subconsciously are like, oh, this is probably true because so many people are talking about it. There's spoofing, where you design websites and copy that looks exactly like a real news website, ABC News, but the C is a slightly different color and the circle is a bit thicker, and it's, so a lot of that was happening. In fact, one specific example from Baduria, during the height of this violence, when both sides were getting more inflamed, a politician in India, this is a person who was holding elected office, tweeted out an image and said, look, the Muslims are raping Hindu women. And it was an image of a man derobing a woman's sari, like kind of taking the sari cloth away from her, and a crowd standing behind. And the caption said something like, our people are doing nothing while our women are getting raped. But that was just out of context. It was a real image, but if you move the camera slightly to the left and see the original image, you see a camera and a director and a film set, because that was a movie being filmed, a very popular movie, in fact. The woman was an actress, the man was an actor. So there was a lot of that kind of stuff happening too. And it led to a lot of real-world violence.
I think one of the things that we were sort of speaking about earlier was there's a lot of talk about deepfakes and the concern around them, but actually memes, taking things out of context, seem as though they are having a larger impact at the moment, possibly?
Totally, because the target audience, if you're trying to cause chaos through misinformation, is not people in this room and us, right? It's not experts who think about this stuff all day and are like, aha, that's a deepfake, that's not a deepfake. It's my aunt and uncle and your grandparents and your children and your nieces. Folks who cheap fakes or memes or whatever are just as good. In fact, everything in Baduria that caused a lot of the violence, every single one of those fake images that was tweeted out and videos was nothing more than real stuff taken out of context or sometimes Photoshop. But that's all it took. It was nothing sophisticated about it.
Cheap fakes
Yeah.
rather than deep fakes. There we go. David, we're going to move from domestic matters to sort of external actors influencing domestic politics in Germany, with anti-immigration disinformation that's been happening over a number of years. Talk us through what you've been working on.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. One thing is we heard about Russian influence. It's in Germany as well. But we had a case in a town of Dortmund, which is a working town, a former mining district of Germany. And there was Breitbart active, the American news service or fake news service, how you call it. And they were spreading their fake news about Syrian people burning down the oldest church in Germany, which is weird. In this mining district town, there is not the oldest church in Germany. In fact, there's nothing close to it. And of course, there were a lot of people from Syria, some of them refugees, some others not. And they had a party on the street because it was New Year's Eve and there were fireworks, and one of these rockets hit a structure next to the church, and there was some plastic. And this rocket enlightened this structure, and it burned for almost 10 seconds, maybe 15. And from that core fact, Breitbart made up Muslims are burning down Germany's oldest church. What was interesting about that, when we debunked the story of Breitbart, we compared it to the speech of Pope Urban almost 1,000 years ago. And it was exactly the same narrative which Pope Urban used to call for the First Crusade. It was exactly the same narrative. And when you look behind this, why do they do that? It's completely insane. They do it, they use this disinformation for disruption, for distraction. They use it to get people polarized. And they use this environment to steer up the populist movements, not only around Germany, but around Europe. I guess you find similar stories in almost every country in Europe. And what is also interesting, what I think what we should have in mind, after we had this Breitbart in Germany, we thought, okay, everybody is talking about the Russians in Europe and what they do. And they do it. It's not that they don't do it. They do it exactly. But here's Breitbart. Are there other interests from other countries? And then there is the Middle East Forum. I guess some of you know it. It's a think tank, or something like a think tank, was funded to steer up confrontation, especially with Iran. That was the purpose of Middle East Forum, to steer up confrontation against Muslims all around the world. And when we discovered that Middle East Forum is active now in Germany, they fund fake news websites in the east of Germany, in the small town of Jena. And I'm not sure why an American think tank founded to attack Iran is now working in eastern Germany and in other places in Europe as well. But to steer up some kind of confrontation, which is in the bigger perspective, a confrontation between Christians and Muslims. And this is something that is really frightening. We don't need it anywhere in the world, I guess.
I'll come to questions from the floor in a moment. So do have a think about what you'd like to ask. I'll ask a general question though, and let me know who would like to take this. Just some quotes from the opening panel. Disinformation targets the framework of international relations, and it's an existential problem for us in the news business. Many of us journalists here. How is this issue that we have heard on so many levels of our society and our culture, how is it changing behaviour of the public, of consumers, of organisations, of governments? Mark, do you want to take this first?
It actually goes to the sort of the thing I would have, didn't want to go on too long on the first thing, but it goes to the next sort of case study I would have brought up, which is around the Syria and the Syria chemical weapons file. And again, I'm afraid Russia is the culprit. It has, what you can see with this kind of disinformation routine is that they have sought to systematically, in this case, undermine the trusted nature of various international institutions. So to your point about kind of breaking apart some of the kind of consensus and some of the things that the international community has come to rely on, one of those institutions is the OPCW. For example, well, there are two, and the UN itself, and there have been multiple investigations now into the use of chemical weapons in Syria. In several cases, the United Nations Joint Investigation Mechanism, which was composed of OPCW experts and UN inspectors, found, for example, that the Syrians had used chemical weapons since they had supposedly disarmed in 2013, in contradiction, in violation, obviously, of Security Council resolutions. In order to basically undermine that uncomfortable fact, because it would prove that Russia was backing a regime which was basically scoffing its nose, which was thumbing its nose at international institutions and norms, they set about undermining the context of those reports. And where there is the problem and the difficulty is that those reports are very detailed and scientific in nature, and frankly beyond not the capacity, but the technicality of them goes beyond what most diplomats, let alone ministers of foreign affairs, etc., are prepared to invest in terms of time to understand them. There are some very damning facts in those reports. One is that, for example, the chemical signature used in the sarin attack on Khan Sheikhoun in 2017 is basically particular to the Syrian chemical weapons program, and it's infinitesimal to the point of being completely impossible that anyone else could have carried that attack, and that is there in very carefully worded, very detailed and very scientific explanation in the UN report. But in order to read that, you need to be an expert, and you need to spend time, and you need to go through the detail, and you need to do it in a non sort of polarized and sort of hyperactive environment, and that's not what we have because of all of the things that we've been discussing here today. So just in a very real example that shows you just how much the kind of systems in which we've come to rely. In the past, no one really used to question UN reports like that. They were experts, they have scientists and people of independence. The head of it was a Guatemalan diplomat, for example. He had no stake in the game as an independent country. All of these things which we've sort of come to rely on as an international community as a means of kind of helping us resolve and sort disputes come under threat because they're being subject to this sort of onslaught that they've never had to withstand before, and things are not faring well, despite the fact that we're trying to sort of shore them up.
Yeah, David.
What I think what is important to understand is, of course, it's a big task for the media landscape or for the political landscape to handle these disinformation campaigns. But what I see is that debunking works. We are with Correctiv doing it for now 3 years in Germany, and it was very long and very hard work, but after now 3 years of work, the biggest distributors of fake news in Germany are leaving Facebook and other social media channels. They're just turning their backs on it. The reason for this is they are not able anymore to get beyond their own filter bubble. They are not able anymore to get a new audience that is important to them to grow. And what they do instead, they go to some Russian websites or some other news services which are completely irrelevant for the political debate in Germany. So what we see is, even in the regions where the populists are the strongest, they are not able anymore to grow. When you see over all of Germany, we are quite good at this. We have now a turnout for the populist movement of around 10% to 12%, so it's better than in other spaces. And I think one of these reasons is that debunking works when you do it for a long time.
I'd love to come to you, Priyank, and ask about solutions in a minute. I'm just going to see if there are any questions from the floor. Yes, gentleman in the third row. There is a microphone coming towards you. Think if you... Is it not working? Do you want to stand up and bellow? Shout and then I'll repeat.
So my question is, in the Western media, Putin and Russia are often portrayed as 10 feet tall. Everything Putin does is this master stroke of genius. And my question is, do you think that's true, or do the Russians just do a lot of things and some of it works? So is it, the fact that they take advantage of every opportunity, and we give them quite a few, or are they just doing what I call the kitchen sink approach, which is they're constantly throwing stuff at the wall, some of it sticks, and that's what we tend to focus on?
Olga, do you want to take this one?
I would say, it's a very interesting question, thank you very much. I would say it's a bit of both sometimes, judging by what we are seeing. Because if you're talking about the 2016 US election and the election interference, then judging by evidence that has been presented, you can see that it's quite a sophisticated operation that involved careful planning quite a while before the election actually took place. But then if you look at the immediate aftermath and the immediate reaction to the Skripal poisoning or even the Moscow protests over the summer, you can see that very often the reaction is quite, you can see that it's not quite pre-planned, that it's just out there and it just throwing, lines at you and see what works and what doesn't. And if some line gets widely debunked and widely discredited by fact checkers, for example, or by officials, it gets dropped and then something else appears or some alternative explanation. So I would say it's a mixture.
Mark, briefly.
Very quickly. I mean, in state policy terms, look at outcomes. It kind of depends on what their objectives were, right? So on Skripal, they had over 150 of their intelligence operatives, basically an entire network disbanded. And they didn't win the argument. Most Western countries agreed with us, didn't agree with them. So that wasn't a good outcome. So I think the thing, on the election stuff as well, it depends. Do they want to be a perpetual and endless enemy at war with the American establishment? Because really all they've done, they may have got somewhere close to a kind of relationship with Donald Trump. I'll leave that question unanswered. That's not my remit. But it's pretty clear the American security apparatus, Congress, etc., are extremely defensive because they've been subject to a hostile attack. And I don't think that's good for Russia, but maybe for Putin it is. I can't comment on his motives.
Thank you. Another question. Yes, gentleman at the back.
In the 80s, Dennis Cooks, who is the head of the Active Measures Working Group in the US, wrote about exactly what we're seeing today. And it doesn't really seem that there's much of a difference between active measures and what we're sort of really focusing on in terms of disinformation on social media or beyond that. Is there a need for a more comprehensive response framework which actually considers some more sort of tactical and kinetic potentially, or beyond sanctions, because it seems that the focus in terms of identifying false narratives or highlighting potential misleading information just really isn't going far enough and doing enough because it's receiving no response by the adversaries.
Priyank, I know that you're interested in sort of systemic change. Would you like to speak to that?
So I think there's a legal approach that you can hold sort of nations and bad actors accountable. The Singapore Home Minister was here today. They just passed a very comprehensive, very tough law to prevent online manipulation and fake news that can jail people and fine them up to $30,000 for posting fake stuff. But I think also on a tactical level, to your question, it's a great question. I think there's three things that we could do. One is countering viral lies with viral truths, right? A lot of fake news relies on its viral ability. It's entertaining, it's catchy, it's on the right platforms, it's the right length, it's the right kind of post. You can make content that counters that and raises awareness of fake news in the same manner. The second thing is penetrating echo chambers. You know, sometimes it's often said that fake news, violent extremism, they're not the disease, they're the symptoms. The disease is echo chambers. People become more vulnerable to believing falsehoods when they're so deep inside an echo chamber that they can't see another point of view. We're actually one of many different practitioners and companies that's using artificial intelligence and machine learning to try and figure out innovative ways to do that online. And I know there's a lot of governments and transnational organizations interested in that. And then thirdly, and this is the least sexy one, but probably, in my opinion, the most important from a tactical perspective, is improving digital literacy. I mean, I didn't, grow up wanting to be a digital literacy person. I got in through, I was a counterterrorism intelligence officer for the US Department of Homeland Security, but working in violent extremism for the last decade or so, it's shown me that there are some real-world examples of really quickly. I'd just like to talk about one young woman who I just came back from interviewing. We're shooting a documentary in Philippines, and I was there, and her story is remarkable. She went to fight, she joined ISIS, essentially, in Syria. She left her hometown, traveled all the way from the Philippines to Syria, and when I asked her why she did it, she said, well, she came from a very small village in Mindanao, southern Philippines. She had just bought a cell phone. It was the only one in her family. And she said there was this guy who kept messaging her, Facebook messaging her, and he'd message her so often in the day that her phone's battery would die because it would keep vibrating. And her family said, you can't have this. It's the only cell phone we have. We can't let it die. You need to respond to this guy. She knew this guy was kind of shady, and everyone in the village knew he had links to Maute and Abu Sayyaf, which are ISIS-affiliated groups. But she replied to his message because she didn't want her phone battery to die because it was too valuable. One thing led to another. Over months, he kind of radicalized her, took her with him to Syria, and she wasted 2 years of her life and is deeply traumatized. And when I said to her, I said, why didn't you just block the guy? Then he couldn't message you. And she said, what's blocking? So nobody had ever told her that you can block. Nobody had ever taught her how to properly use these apps. We take this stuff for granted, but in many parts of the world, there's a lot of people for whom, having no access to technology whatsoever before, never having had a landline or a refrigerator in her home, suddenly she gets a smartphone. In my opinion, that's as irresponsible as not knowing how to ride a bicycle and suddenly giving that person keys to a truck and saying, go drive on the highway, I hope you don't hurt anybody. So I think digital literacy is something we can absolutely, and that's an easy, low-hanging fruit. Through seminars, workshops, integrating it into school curriculums, that's something that we should definitely all be doing more of.
I know the BBC are very involved in this sort of space. I mean, the question of debunking is a really interesting one. David, you say it works. Olga, I mean, what is your take on debunking, on the need to come out fighting, and as far as verification is concerned?
Well, I would say that debunking, I mean, it sounds very interesting, but I think generally debunking one claim after another religiously, you're just going to be buried under it. And I think it's far more efficient and far more interesting even to the audience to take a step back and look at campaigns, look at narratives, look at why things are being said and who says them and who's behind the campaigns and how tactics works. And I think recently researchers from Oxford, if I'm not mistaken, they came up with the idea of a fake news game that essentially puts people in the shoes of a fake news purveyor and essentially explains to them how tactics work and how you spread fake news. And apparently this has had an effect on people's ability to recognize and see fake news, because when you understand how things work, you get essentially immune from it, at least partly.
Interesting. Another question. Yes, microphone's coming towards you.
Hi, I'm Kevin Barron, Executive Editor of Defense One. I wonder if you could talk a little about the UK this year passed a new counterterrorism law, and part of that law on the opposite side of the disinformation question is limiting or monitoring what citizens see online, what they go look at. And critics have said it's a step too far, it limits freedom of expression or curiosity just to go online and look at these things, and raises some difficult issues of how to properly police when for instance, a journalist is going to look at terrorist videos versus somebody who's innocent versus somebody who might actually be looking to be radicalized or associated on that side of the equation, and how that fits into what you're saying about digital literacy and what governments are doing about it.
Mark, would you like to take this? Sorry.
I don't actually, I'm not massively familiar with that piece of legislation, but I was involved in some of the discussions that kind of led to it. And I think it, you know, there's, I think, let me pivot this way. I think that the government does have an obligation, and I think we've discussed it in various points in this room, to try and moderate the space. And I think in the UK what we're trying to do is, you know, I think someone alluded to earlier that they were under pressure from partner governments from the US. It was the colonel who was the national security advisor to sort of be tougher with the social media companies. I don't think it's a particular secret that one of those partner governments, probably, I don't know if he's specifically referring to us, but we have had a slightly more, Prime Minister May certainly wanted a slightly more robust posture towards some of the tech companies and some of the space. And the legislative piece of legislation you're talking about is partly a result of that. But I think that the overarching goal has to be to try and somehow kind of continue to preserve some of the rules of the game. I think the point that Olga just made is really interesting. We, on the part of government, have to try and maintain ourselves in the space of being, I think, the sort of a trustworthy source of information, which I think is sometimes difficult, but it means that we have to resist the urge to kind of go down the Russian route and kind of like lose our sense, but also try and use legislation in as light touch a way as possible to try and preserve the space. And we've done that, if you think about it, in the past in areas like race relations, the Race Relations Act, when it came out, a lot of people felt uncomfortable that it was straying into areas of what government can and think in the UK. So it's not unprecedented, and there's a fine line there, but I think the government is trying to strike that balance, if that's a sort of fair answer.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether anyone else has experience of governments or authorities where they have got it right. I mean, David, you were saying that in Germany it seems to be working, having some effect.
The changing laws does not work. This is what is not working. They introduced a law against hate speech on social media, and it was widely discussed, and it does not work at all. So it doesn't stop any fake news, it doesn't stop any hate speech, so this is not working. But what is really working is debunking, step by step by step. The point is, you're not convincing anybody with it. You're not like convincing people in the echo chamber what is true or what is not true. That is not the point. The point is that the people who distribute the fake news, they will be not as reliable as they used before. So their audience is shrinking, and shrinking but very rapidly. We had the discussions with the populist movement in Germany. They had a media round table, and were discussing with each other about their strategies, what they should do, and how they could better penetrate the public. And we were able to have also somebody of our reporters on this board. And they said the biggest threat that they experience in their media strategies is debunking, because they could only preach to their own. They are not able anymore to preach to any other. And this is, from my point of view, the only way which we can use to work really aggressively against these threats.
Yeah.
Do we have a bit more time? First of all, in order not to be a purveyor of fake news, I think it was Cambridge, but Oxford and Cambridge. Anyway, so I would say that legislation is a very popular measure because our team has been looking at efforts to tackle fake news that are being implemented by various governments across the globe. And we looked at roughly 20 countries in four continents. And what we found that very often the quick fix is, let's introduce a law that tackles fake news as a problem. But very often what then happens is there's a very loud public backlash, or there are sometimes discussions about censorship and questions raised about who has the monopoly on truth and what truth means. And as was the case in Germany, there were even cases when German officials got their very old tweets banned because they violated the new law, and they were in that case, it was done by mistake. So legislation is a very interesting way and seems like a very straightforward way of approaching the issue. However, the less controversial way of tackling disinformation appears to be media literacy and promoting media literacy. Again, promoting the ideas of how campaign works, how tactics evolve, how to use social media apps. So far, we've only seen limited research in this and limited number of programs, and very often they are aimed at school children. But for example, one of the programs in Ukraine a couple of years ago was implemented in 50 schools across the country in several regions, and the result was quite interesting because the evaluation that was done afterwards, after a few months, the kids went to school and had information about verification and generally media literacy in their daily curriculum. Their ability to recognize fake news was 20%, roughly 20% higher than their peers, which sounds like not much, but actually is a lot.
That is significant, thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Okay, I'm just going to ask you one final question then, and then I think we can get a little bit more time back. Tech companies, what role should they be playing in this? Priyank.
Well, I think that if you buy a video game, if you buy like FIFA or something, which my nephew plays, before you can start playing, you have to do a tutorial. It says press B to pass, press A to shoot. Even if you're an experienced player, it takes 30 seconds. If you're not an experienced player, it takes 3 minutes. I think this is just a suggestion, but to prevent the kinds of things like that young woman I talked about in the Philippines, when you register for Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or TikTok, maybe you ought to be able to, or you ought to have to take a mini tutorial that teaches you this is how you protect yourself against trolls, this is how you can tell something is probably fake news, etc., etc. I mean, it's not going to inoculate 100% of people all the time, but I think what they should be doing, tech companies, is offering some level of education, some level of protection for their own users. And it's in their own users' benefit. As somebody said this morning, that if you can trust the apps, people's affinity to those apps, their loyalties are only going to grow. So I think that's one small tangible step they could take. Of course, it might cause a dip in users, which is, I'm guessing, why they'd be hesitant to do it, but it's in my opinion, worth it.
And David, just turning to you as an investigative journalist, one of the things that Facebook have done reasonably recently is a team of fact checkers, and we hear, I think last month they were saying that actually political adverts will not be part of the fact checking process. Do you think they should be upping their game? Is this something that they should be more sort of on the front foot on?
We are also partnering with Facebook in fact checking, and there's a lot of discussion right now in the preparation of the next election in the US. What is the outcome of this discussion? I don't know. What I think what is really necessary, especially from a German point of view, it should be possible to debunk also political statements, but not as an opinion, only of matter of facts. When there are facts within something like a speech or an announcement or something, there should never be the case that opinion pieces should be fact-checked. Opinion is really very important and should be free.
Thank you. I think we'll probably draw it to a close in that case. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for staying, and thank you to the panel.